Historical Fiction, Part 1 Note. This is a work of fiction inspired by royal family dynamics throughout history. The morning mist hung heavy over the palace grounds as Edward stood at his office window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. His hands trembled slightly as he held the letter that had arrived just hours before. The medical report contained words that seemed to blur together on the page, each sentence carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Margaret had always been the strongest among them. Even as a child, she had possessed an inner steel that could bend but never break. When she married into the royal family 12 years ago, many had questioned whether a commoner could truly understand the burden of crown and country. Those doubts had been silenced long ago by her grace, her dedication, and her unwavering commitment to the people she served. The irony was not lost on Edward that the woman who had spent years supporting others through their darkest moments now faced her own shadow. He remembered the countless hospital visits she had made, the way she would sit with sick children and somehow make them forget their pain for just a moment. Her genuine compassion had never been an act for the cameras. It was simply who she was, woven into the very fabric of her being. Thomas entered the room quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet that had been a gift from a foreign dignitary decades earlier. Father and son had developed an unspoken language over the years, a way of communicating that transcended words. Thomas could read the tension in his father's shoulders, the way his usually perfect posture had given way to something more human, more vulnerable. "The physicians want to meet with us this afternoon," Edward said without turning from the window. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged considerably in just a few short hours. The crown had taught him to carry many burdens, but this one felt different. This was personal in a way that state affairs never were. Thomas moved to stand beside his father, looking out at the same view that had comforted and troubled generations of royals before them. "How much do we tell the children?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying all the weight of parental love and responsibility. The palace had always been a place where private grief and public duty intersected in complicated ways. Every decision had to be weighed against its impact on the monarchy, on the nation, on the delicate balance between transparency and privacy that had been negotiated over centuries. Yet in this moment, all of those considerations seemed to fade away, leaving only a family facing an uncertain future. Margaret's diagnosis had come as a shock to everyone. She had mentioned feeling tired lately, but attributed it to her busy schedule of charitable work and official engagements. The persistent headaches she had dismissed as stress. Even the occasional dizzy spells had been explained away by her packed calendar and lack of proper rest. It was only when she collapsed during a private meeting with her patronage organizations that the truth began to emerge. The medical team had been thorough, running every test imaginable before delivering their verdict. The tumor was small but aggressive, located in a part of the brain that controlled memory and personality. Surgery was possible, but the risks were significant. Even with the best possible outcome, there would be changes that no amount of royal training could prepare them for. Edward finally turned from the window, his eyes meeting his son's with a mixture of determination and fear. "We tell them the truth," he said firmly. "But we also tell them that we face this together as a family. The crown has survived wars, scandals, and countless challenges. It will survive this too." The weight of legacy pressed down on both men as they stood in the room, where so many crucial decisions had been made. They were not just husband and son facing a medical crisis. They were representatives of an institution that had to project strength, even in moments of profound weakness. The public would need to be informed, but how much and when remained questions that would require careful consideration. Thomas thought of his children, of how to explain to them that their beloved grandmother, the woman who had taught them to bake cookies and told them stories of ancient kings and queens, was facing a battle that might change everything they knew about her. The palace had always been their sanctuary, a place where they could be children despite their extraordinary circumstances. Now that sanctuary felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond anyone's control. As the morning sun finally broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the room, both men understood that they stood at the beginning of a journey that would test everything they thought they knew about duty, family, and the price of public service. The decisions they made in the coming days would echo through history. becoming part of the royal story that future generations would study and remember. The palace bells chimed the hour, their ancient rhythm unchanged by the crisis unfolding within the walls they protected. Life would continue as it always had, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. Historical Fiction, Part 2 Note. This is a work of fiction inspired by royal family dynamics throughout history. The afternoon meeting with the medical team had lasted 3 grueling hours. Dr. Harrison, the kingdom's most respected neurosurgeon, had explained the procedure in clinical terms that somehow made the situation feel both more real and more surreal. Margaret sat quietly throughout most of the discussion, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she had maintained during state dinners and diplomatic crises. The surgery itself will take approximately 8 hours, Dr. Harrison explained, his voice gentle but professional. We'll need to map the brain tissue carefully to preserve as much function as possible. There are no guarantees, but we have every reason to be optimistic about the outcome. Thomas watched his wife's face for any sign of fear or doubt, but Margaret had retreated into that place of inner calm that had served her so well during their years of public service. She asked practical questions about recovery time, about how the procedure might affect her ability to fulfill her royal duties, about whether she would still be able to recognize their children's faces. The children had been told that their mother needed an operation, but the full gravity of the situation had been carefully moderated for their young minds. 10-year-old James had accepted the explanation with the stoic acceptance he had learned from watching his grandfather, while 8-year-old Isabella had peppered them with questions that revealed both her intelligence and her deep concern for the woman who had become the center of their world. Will grandmother still remember our bedtime stories? Isabella had asked, her small hand clutching Margaret's with desperate intensity. The question had nearly broken Thomas's carefully maintained composure, reminding him that this crisis extended far beyond the immediate family to include everyone who had been touched by Margaret's kindness over the years. The palace staff had been informed of the situation in a private meeting that afternoon. Mrs. Fletcher, who had served as Margaret's personal secretary for over a decade, had wept openly when told about the diagnosis. The security team, the household staff, even the gardeners who had watched Margaret tend to her roses each morning, all understood that they were facing the potential loss of someone who had treated them not as servants but as extended family. The question of public announcement loomed large over every conversation. The press office had prepared several different statements, each calibrated for different potential outcomes. The monarchy had weathered many storms by controlling the flow of information, but medical crises presented unique challenges. There would be no hiding Margaret's absence from public engagements, no way to explain away the changes that might come after surgery. Edward found himself remembering his own mother's final years, when she had gradually withdrawn from public life as age took its inevitable toll. That transition had been gradual, allowing the institution to adapt slowly to the changing dynamics. This felt different, more sudden, like a storm that had appeared without warning on a clear day. The royal physicians had consulted with specialists around the world, seeking second and third opinions on the best course of treatment. The consensus was unanimous. Surgery offered the best chance for a positive outcome, but the risks were significant. There was a possibility that Margaret might lose some of her memories, that her personality might change in subtle or dramatic ways, that the woman who emerged from the operating room might be different from the one who entered. Margaret had requested a private meeting with her chaplain that evening, seeking spiritual guidance for the journey ahead. She had always been a woman of deep faith, finding strength in prayer during the most challenging moments of royal life. The chaplain later described their conversation as one of the most profound discussions about mortality and purpose he had ever experienced. She spoke about legacy, he confided to Thomas later that evening. Not the kind of legacy that gets recorded in history books, but the smaller legacies we leave in the lives we touch every day. She wanted to make sure that her work with the children's charities would continue, that the families she had supported would not be forgotten. The international implications were also becoming clear. Margaret had developed close relationships with royal families and government leaders around the world. Her illness would send ripples through diplomatic circles, affecting everything from trade negotiations to cultural exchanges. The monarchy was not just a domestic institution, but a symbol of national identity that projected far beyond the kingdom's borders. As night fell over the palace, Thomas found Margaret in the garden where she had spent so many peaceful hours over the years. She was sitting on the bench beneath the ancient willow tree, looking up at the stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties. The moonlight caught the silver threads in her hair, reminding him of how much they had both changed since their wedding day. "Are you frightened?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench that had been placed there by his great-grandfather decades earlier. Margaret considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I'm frightened of forgetting," she said finally. "Not the official things, not the protocols and procedures we've learned. I'm frightened of forgetting the way Isabella laughs when she's truly happy, or how James's face lights up when he solves a difficult problem. Those are the memories that make everything else worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned to find strength in each other during the most challenging moments of their extraordinary life together. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, giving them time to prepare both practically and emotionally for whatever lay ahead. The weight of tomorrow's decisions pressed down on them both, but in that quiet moment under the stars, they were simply a husband and wife facing an uncertain future with whatever courage they could summon. Historical Fiction, Part 3 Note. This is a work of fiction inspired by royal family dynamics throughout history. The decision to make a public announcement had been reached after countless hours of deliberation between the royal family, their advisors, and the communications team. The statement would be released simultaneously to all major news outlets, followed by a joint address from Edward and Thomas that would be broadcast across the nation that evening. Margaret had insisted on participating in the recording, despite the gentle protests from her medical team. She understood better than anyone how her absence would be interpreted by the public, how speculation and rumor could fill the vacuum left by official silence. The people deserved to hear from her directly, even if it might be one of the last times she could address them with complete clarity. The recording studio in the palace's east wing had been transformed into a comfortable sitting room, with soft lighting that would be kind to Margaret's increasingly frequent headaches. The royal filmmaker, a man who had documented the family's public appearances for over 20 years, worked carefully to create an atmosphere that felt intimate rather than formal. Margaret wore a simple blue dress, one that had become associated with her charitable work rather than state occasions. Her jewelry was minimal, just her wedding ring and a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to Thomas's grandmother. She had specifically requested that nothing about her appearance suggest drama or crisis, wanting instead to project the calm strength that had defined her public persona for over a decade. "The doctors have discovered a small growth in my brain that requires surgical removal," Margaret said directly to the camera, her voice steady and clear. "While any medical procedure carries risks, I am in excellent hands with our medical team, and I remain optimistic about the outcome. I am grateful for the prayers and support of people throughout our kingdom and around the world." The statement had been crafted carefully to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation without creating unnecessary alarm. Medical privacy laws meant that specific details about the diagnosis and prognosis could remain confidential. But the royal family had chosen transparency over secrecy in hopes of controlling the narrative that would inevitably emerge. Thomas spoke next, his words prepared but delivered with genuine emotion. "Our family has always drawn strength from the support of the people we serve. During this challenging time, we ask for your continued prayers and patience as we focus on what matters most: Margaret's health and recovery." Edward concluded the address with remarks about the continuity of royal duties and the temporary adjustments that would be made to the family's public schedule. Palace officials had already begun reaching out to the various organizations and charities that depended on royal patronage, assuring them that their work would continue with minimal disruption. The reaction from the public had been immediate and overwhelming. Flowers began appearing at the palace gates within hours of the announcement, joined by handwritten notes, children's drawings, and small gifts from people who had been touched by Margaret's work over the years. The royal protection officers had to establish special protocols for managing the growing memorial of support and affection. Social media platforms lit up with messages of encouragement from around the world. The hashtag #PrayForMargaret began trending within minutes of the broadcast, accompanied by photos and stories from people whose lives had been changed by her charitable work. Hospital patients shared pictures of her visits. School children posted drawings she had admired during official openings. and families affected by her various causes offered their own prayers and support. International reactions poured in from royal families, heads of state, and diplomatic missions. The French president released a statement praising Margaret's dedication to international cooperation and cultural exchange. The Queen of Denmark sent a personal letter that was hand-delivered by diplomatic courier. Even nations with complicated relationships with the monarchy found ways to express respect for Margaret's humanitarian work. The children's charities that Margaret had championed became focal points for public expressions of support. Donations increased dramatically in the days following the announcement, as people sought concrete ways to honor her legacy while hoping for her recovery. The children's hospital she had helped establish received enough contributions in a single week to fund a new research wing. Behind the scenes, the palace machinery worked tirelessly to manage the crisis while maintaining normal operations. The royal calendar had to be restructured, with Thomas taking on additional responsibilities and Edward making rare public appearances to ensure continuity of the institution's work. Staff members who had rarely interacted with media attention found themselves thrust into the spotlight as the world's press sought any detail about Margaret's condition. Dr. Harrison and his team worked around the clock to finalize their surgical plan, consulting with specialists from medical centers around the world. The procedure had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, allowing enough time for thorough preparation, while not prolonging the period of uncertainty that was taking its toll on everyone involved. Margaret spent her remaining days before surgery saying goodbye to the various aspects of her life that might change after the operation. She recorded personal messages for each of her major charitable organizations, offering encouragement and guidance for their future work. She also spent hours with James and Isabella, creating memory books filled with photographs and stories that would help them remember their time together, regardless of how the surgery affected her own recollections. The garden where she had found so much peace became a place of pilgrimage for family members and close friends. The roses she had planted over the years were blooming magnificently, as if nature itself was offering a tribute to the woman who had tended them with such care. Thomas often found her there in the early morning hours, memorizing the details of a place that had become sacred to their family's story. As the day of surgery approached, the kingdom held its collective breath. Churches of all denominations organized special prayer services, while secular organizations planned their own vigils and ceremonies of support. The woman who had spent her adult life serving others had become the focus of an unprecedented outpouring of love and concern from the very people she had dedicated herself to helping. The night before the operation, Margaret lay awake thinking about all the lives she had been privileged to touch, and all the lives that had touched hers in return. Whatever tomorrow would bring, she knew that she had been part of something larger than herself, something that would continue long after her own story had ended. Historical Fiction, Part 4 Note. This is a work of fiction inspired by royal family dynamics throughout history. The morning of the surgery arrived with an unusual quiet that seemed to settle over the entire capital city. Margaret woke before dawn, as had become her habit in recent weeks, and made her way to the window that overlooked the gardens she loved so dearly. The groundskeepers had arrived early, moving with the respectful efficiency that characterized all palace staff during times of crisis. Thomas found her there an hour later, still in her dressing gown, watching the sunrise paint the ancient walls in shades of gold and rose. They had said everything that needed to be said in the weeks leading up to this day. But the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the understanding that comes from years of facing challenges together. "The children want to see you before we leave for the hospital," Thomas said gently, settling into the chair beside her. They had debated whether James and Isabella should visit the medical facility, ultimately deciding that saying goodbye at home would be less traumatic for their young minds. Margaret nodded, straightening her shoulders in the gesture that had become second nature after years of royal duties. Even facing her greatest personal challenge, she remained mindful of her role as grandmother, mother figure, and symbol of stability for those who depended on her strength. James entered the room first, his 10-year-old composure wavering only slightly as he approached the woman who had been his guide through the complexities of royal life. He had prepared a drawing the night before, a picture of their family standing together in the palace garden, with careful attention to the roses that Margaret had taught him to identify by name. "I drew this so you won't forget us," he said with the matter-of-fact directness of childhood, unaware that his words carried the weight of everyone's deepest fears. Isabella followed, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the section of garden designated as her own special place. At 8 years old, she possessed an intuitive understanding of emotions that often surprised the adults around her. She climbed into Margaret's lap without ceremony, a privilege reserved for private family moments. "Will you still love us if you forget our names?" Isabella asked, the question that had been haunting her since overhearing adult conversations about memory loss and personality changes. Margaret held her granddaughter close, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with answering such profound questions. "Love doesn't live in memory," she said carefully. "It lives in the heart, and hearts don't forget the most important things. Even if my mind changes, my heart will always know who you are." Edward joined them for a quiet breakfast in the family's private dining room, a space that had witnessed celebrations and sorrows spanning multiple generations. The morning meal was simple: toast and tea, the kind of comfort food that had sustained the family through countless difficult mornings. Conversation was minimal, but the presence of each family member provided an anchor of normalcy in circumstances that felt anything but normal. The drive to the hospital took place in relative silence, with Margaret watching the city pass by through windows that had been tinted to provide privacy from the crowds of well-wishers and media personnel who lined the route. The outpouring of public support had continued to grow in the days leading up to the surgery, transforming the area around both the palace and the medical facility into improvised shrines of flowers, cards, and small gifts. Dr. Harrison met them at a private entrance that allowed the family to avoid the media circus that had established itself in the hospital's main areas. The surgical team had been preparing for weeks, reviewing every aspect of the procedure with the thoroughness that such high-profile cases demanded. The operation would take place in the hospital's most advanced surgical suite, with backup teams and equipment standing by for any eventuality. The preoperative procedures followed standard medical protocols, but nothing about the day felt routine. Margaret changed into surgical attire, while Thomas and Edward met with the anesthesiology team to review final details about the procedure. The medical staff moved with professional efficiency, but everyone understood the historical significance of what they were undertaking. Margaret's final moments of consciousness before the surgery were spent holding Thomas's hand while Dr. Harrison explained the immediate steps that would follow. She had requested minimal sedation until the actual procedure began, wanting to remain alert for as long as possible. Her last words before the anesthesia took effect were a simple, "I love you," directed at Thomas, who would spend the next 8 hours in a waiting room designed for families facing exactly this kind of vigil. The waiting area had been cleared of other patients' families to provide privacy for the royal family and their closest advisors. Edward sat in one corner, reading official dispatches that had been delivered throughout the morning, maintaining his royal duties even during personal crisis. Thomas paced the hallway outside, unable to sit still while imagining the delicate work being performed on the person he loved most in the world. Palace officials provided regular updates to the media and the public, carefully managing information flow without violating medical privacy. The official statements were brief and professional. Surgery had begun on schedule. The medical team was proceeding as planned. No complications had been reported. Each update was analyzed by news commentators and royal watchers for hidden meanings and implications. Around the world, people found their own ways to mark the hours during which Margaret's future was being determined. Churches held special services with congregations praying for successful surgery and complete recovery. School children who had met Margaret during her charitable work created get-well cards that would eventually fill several rooms in the hospital's administrative wing. The surgical team worked with precision that reflected years of training and preparation. Dr. Harrison narrated his progress to a small team of observers, medical students who would remember this procedure for the rest of their careers. The tumor was located exactly where diagnostic imaging had indicated, small but aggressive, requiring careful removal to preserve surrounding brain tissue. 4 hours into the surgery, Dr. Harrison encountered the first significant challenge. The tumor had grown closer to critical brain areas than initially estimated, requiring more extensive removal than originally planned. The decision to proceed with the more aggressive approach was made in consultation with the senior surgical team, weighing the risks of incomplete removal against the potential for greater post-operative complications. Thomas received updates every 2 hours, brief reports that provided reassurance without specific medical details. Each conversation with the surgical coordinator stretched the boundaries of his patience and composure. The waiting had become its own form of torture, made worse by the knowledge that millions of people around the world were sharing his vigil through news reports and social media updates. As the 8th hour of surgery approached, the medical team began the delicate process of closing the surgical site and preparing Margaret for the critical first hours of recovery. The procedure had been successful in removing the tumor completely, but the true test would come in the days and weeks that followed, as her brain healed and her cognitive functions were gradually assessed. The moment when Dr. Harrison emerged from the surgical suite would be remembered by everyone present. His tired but relieved expression told the story before his words could provide the details that Thomas and Edward desperately needed to hear. Historical Fiction. Part 6 Note. This is a work of fiction inspired by royal family dynamics throughout history. 6 months after the surgery, Margaret stood in her beloved garden, tending to the roses that had somehow managed to thrive despite her extended absence. The physical act of gardening had become part of her therapy, helping to rebuild the fine motor skills that had been affected by the operation. More importantly, it connected her to memories and routines that anchored her sense of identity during a period of profound change. The woman who emerged from her recovery was recognizably Margaret, but fundamentally different in ways that surprised everyone who knew her well. Her diplomatic reserve had been replaced by a more authentic emotional expression that made her interactions with people more genuine, if less predictable. Children especially seemed to respond to this new openness, finding her more approachable than the carefully composed figure she had been before. Thomas watched from the library window as Margaret worked in the garden, accompanied by Isabella, who had appointed herself as chief assistant gardener. Their conversations were punctuated by laughter in a way that would have been unusual before the surgery, when Margaret's interactions with the children had been loving, but more formal. The brain injury that had taken some things away had also given unexpected gifts. The decision about Margaret's return to official duties had required months of careful consideration and planning. Traditional royal protocols had no precedent for managing a senior family member whose capabilities had been altered by medical treatment. The palace communications team worked with medical advisors to develop new approaches that would allow Margaret to contribute meaningfully while acknowledging her changed circumstances. Her first public appearance after the surgery had been at the annual gala for the children's hospital she had helped establish. Rather than delivering the scripted remarks that had characterized her previous speeches, Margaret spoke spontaneously about her own experience as a patient, creating an unexpectedly powerful connection with the audience of medical professionals and families affected by serious illness. "I learned that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak," she told the gathering, her words carrying an authenticity that scripted speeches had never achieved. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is admit that we need help, and then allow others to provide it with grace and gratitude." The response to her changed approach was overwhelmingly positive. People who had admired Margaret's previous dignity and composure found themselves even more drawn to her newfound emotional honesty. Letters poured in from families dealing with brain injuries and other medical challenges, expressing gratitude for having a prominent figure who understood their experiences firsthand. Dr. Harrison continued to monitor Margaret's progress through regular consultations, documenting her recovery for medical literature while ensuring her ongoing health needs were met. Her case had become a valuable study in brain plasticity and recovery, offering insights that would help future patients facing similar challenges. "She's achieved something remarkable," he explained to Thomas during one of their checkups. "Rather than trying to become exactly who she was before, she's adapted to create a new version of herself that incorporates both her losses and her gains. It's a model of resilience that we don't see often enough." The family dynamics had evolved to accommodate Margaret's changed needs while celebrating her continued contributions. Edward took on additional ceremonial duties, while Thomas managed many of the administrative responsibilities that Margaret had previously handled. The children learned to see their grandmother's differences as interesting rather than concerning, accepting her occasional confusion about recent events while treasuring her enhanced emotional availability. Margaret's charitable work took on new dimensions as she became an advocate for brain injury awareness and medical research funding. Her personal experience with surgery and recovery gave her a credibility that traditional royal patronage could never have achieved. She spoke at medical conferences and met with research scientists, contributing to conversations about patient care and treatment innovation. The garden project that became her signature initiative emerged from her own therapeutic activities. Working with landscape architects and occupational therapists, Margaret designed healing gardens for hospitals and rehabilitation centers, spaces that would provide comfort and beauty for patients and families facing medical challenges. Gardens have always been places of hope, she explained to a group of medical students during one of her facility visits. Even in winter, when everything looks dead, there are roots and seeds preparing for spring. Recovery is like that too. Sometimes the most important growth happens where you can't see it. The healing garden at the Children's Hospital became Margaret's most visible legacy project. Designed with input from child psychologists and horticultural therapists, the space included sensory plants that could be safely touched and smelled, quiet alcoves where families could find privacy during difficult conversations, and memorial areas where those who had lost loved ones could find comfort among growing things. Historical Fiction, Part 5 Note. This is a work of fiction inspired by royal family dynamics throughout history. The surgery was successful, Dr. Harrison announced, his voice carrying the exhaustion of 8 hours in the operating room, but also the satisfaction of a job well done. We were able to remove the tumor completely, and initial signs suggest that we preserved the surrounding brain tissue. The next 48 hours will be critical as we monitor her recovery and assess cognitive function. Thomas felt his knees weaken with relief, the tension that had built up over months of uncertainty finally finding release. Edward placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, his own emotions carefully controlled but visible in the slight tremor of his fingers. The palace communications team immediately began preparing statements for release to the anxious public that had been following every development. Margaret's recovery began in the hospital's most advanced intensive care unit, where she would remain under constant observation while her brain began the complex process of healing. The medical team had warned that the first few days would be unpredictable, with consciousness returning gradually and cognitive abilities emerging in stages that might not follow any predictable pattern. The first sign of awareness came 18 hours after surgery, when Margaret opened her eyes and seemed to recognize Thomas's voice. She couldn't speak yet due to the breathing tube that was supporting her recovery, but she was able to squeeze his hand in response to simple questions. The gesture was small but monumental, suggesting that her basic cognitive functions remained intact. Dr. Harrison cautiously optimistic during his first post-operative briefing with the family. Her responses are encouraging, he explained. She's following simple commands and showing recognition of familiar voices. We'll continue monitoring for the next several days before making any definitive assessments about long-term effects. The removal of the breathing tube on the second day marked another milestone in Margaret's recovery. Her first words were barely audible, asking for water and inquiring about James and Isabella. The fact that she remembered her grandchildren's names brought tears to Thomas's eyes, though the medical team cautioned that memory recovery might be inconsistent in the early stages. Palace officials released carefully worded updates about Margaret's progress, balancing the public's desire for information with medical privacy concerns. The statements acknowledged that she was conscious and responsive while noting that full recovery would be a gradual process requiring weeks or months of careful monitoring and rehabilitation. The children were allowed to visit on the third day after surgery, though their time with Margaret was limited to brief moments designed to minimize fatigue while providing emotional comfort for everyone involved. James approached her hospital bed with the same careful dignity he had learned from watching royal protocols, while Isabella climbed onto the chair beside her grandmother with characteristic directness. "Do you remember our bedtime stories?" Isabella asked, the question that had worried her most during the long days of waiting. Margaret smiled weakly but genuinely, her voice still hoarse from the surgery. "I remember a little girl who loved stories about brave princesses and magical gardens," she said. "And I remember that she gives the very best hugs in the entire kingdom." The interaction was brief but profound, confirming that while Margaret might face challenges in her recovery, the essential connections that defined her relationships remained strong. The medical team noted her emotional responses and social recognition as positive indicators for her long-term prognosis. Physical therapy began within days of the surgery, with Margaret working to regain strength and coordination that had been affected by the procedure. Simple tasks like walking to the bathroom or writing her own name became major accomplishments requiring patience and determination. The woman who had managed complex diplomatic situations now celebrated being able to sign her name legibly. The rehabilitation process revealed both losses and unexpected discoveries. Margaret's short-term memory had been affected, making it difficult for her to remember conversations from earlier in the day or to keep track of her daily schedule. However, her long-term memories remained largely intact, and she could recall childhood experiences and early years of marriage with startling clarity. More challenging was the subtle change in her personality that became apparent as the weeks passed. The composed, diplomatic demeanor that had served her so well in royal duties had been replaced by a more direct, emotionally expressive approach to interactions. She laughed more easily but also showed frustration more openly, creating awkward moments during the carefully managed visits from palace officials. Dr. Harrison explained that personality changes were not uncommon after brain surgery, particularly when the affected area controlled social inhibitions and emotional regulation. "She's still fundamentally the same person," he assured Thomas during one of their regular consultations, "but she may express herself differently than she did before the surgery." The challenge of managing Margaret's return to public life became apparent during her first official visitor, a representative from one of her major charities who came to discuss ongoing projects. Margaret listened attentively but struggled to remember details from previous meetings and became emotional when discussing children who had been helped by the organization's programs. "I can't do this the way I used to," she confided to Thomas that evening. "I want to help, but I can't remember the names and faces that used to be so clear in my mind. How can I represent causes I can't fully remember?" The conversation marked a turning point in how the family approached Margaret's recovery and future role. Rather than trying to restore her previous capabilities, they began exploring how her changed abilities might serve different but equally important purposes. Her increased emotional openness while challenging in formal settings created deeper connections with the people she met. The children adapted to their grandmother's changes with the flexibility that characterizes childhood resilience. They learned to remind her of recent events and discovered that her altered personality made her more playful and spontaneous than she had been before the surgery. Isabella particularly enjoyed the fact that Margaret was now more likely to join in silly games and imaginative play. Thomas found himself becoming Margaret's advocate and interpreter, helping bridge the gap between her changed capabilities and the expectations of royal duty. He learned to recognize when she was becoming overwhelmed by formal situations and developed strategies for managing her public appearances to minimize stress while maximizing her ability to connect with people. The palace staff adjusted their routines to accommodate Margaret's new needs, providing gentle reminders about daily schedules and offering support without making her feel dependent or incapable. Mrs. Fletcher, her longtime secretary, became particularly skilled at helping Margaret prepare for meetings by providing written summaries of previous conversations and key points to remember. As the months passed, a new normal emerged that was different from what anyone had expected, but surprisingly fulfilling in its own way. Margaret's recovery had taken an unexpected path, but she remained a beloved figure whose changed perspective on life brought unexpected insights to her family and her work. James and Isabella often accompanied Margaret to the garden openings, learning to see their grandmother's work as an extension of the family's service to the kingdom. At 12 and 10 years old, respectively, they had developed a mature understanding of how personal challenges could be transformed into opportunities to help others. "Grandmother teaches us that being different isn't the same as being broken," James explained to a reporter during one carefully managed media interaction. His words reflected the family's new understanding of disability and recovery. perspectives that had been shaped by watching Margaret navigate her changed world with grace and determination. The international impact of Margaret's story extended far beyond the kingdom's borders. Medical professionals around the world cited her case as an example of successful brain injury recovery, while royal families in other nations looked to her example when facing their own health crises. Her willingness to discuss her challenges openly had helped reduce stigma around brain injuries and cognitive differences. Thomas found that his relationship with Margaret had deepened in unexpected ways during her recovery. The careful emotional distance that royal training had taught them to maintain had been replaced by a more intimate partnership built around shared vulnerability and mutual support. They had learned to navigate her memory challenges together, developing systems and routines that honored both her capabilities and her limitations. "She's taught me that love isn't about remembering every detail," Thomas reflected during a private interview with the palace historian who was documenting this period for future research. "It's about choosing to build something beautiful together, even when the foundation has shifted." The evening routine they had developed epitomized this new approach to their relationship. Rather than discussing the day's official business, as had been their habit before the surgery, they now spent time looking through photograph albums and journals that helped Margaret maintain connections to memories that might otherwise fade. These sessions often led to discoveries of forgotten details and new perspectives on shared experiences. Margaret's writing had become another unexpected outlet for her changed cognitive abilities. Unable to manage the complex scheduling and multitasking that had characterized her previous work, she found solace in keeping detailed journals about her recovery experience. These writings, initially intended as private reflection, eventually became the foundation for a book about resilience and adaptation that would help countless other families facing similar challenges. The annual memorial service for her surgery date had become a family tradition, marking not the trauma of illness, but the beginning of a new chapter that had brought unexpected gifts along with its challenges. They gathered in the palace chapel for a private service of thanksgiving, acknowledging both what had been lost and what had been gained through their journey. As the second anniversary of her diagnosis approached, Margaret stood once again in her garden, surrounded by roses that had been planted during her recovery as symbols of hope and renewal. The woman who had emerged from the operating room was different from the one who had entered, but she was whole in ways that surprised everyone who loved her. The kingdom had witnessed something remarkable. A royal family that had chosen transparency over secrecy, adaptation over denial, and love over fear. Their story had become part of the larger narrative about how institutions and individuals could evolve while maintaining their essential purpose and dignity. Children from the hospitals Margaret visited often sent her drawings of gardens and flowers, understanding instinctively that she had transformed her own difficulties into gifts for others. Their artwork covered the walls of her private study, a colorful reminder that healing often involved not just recovery, but growth into something entirely new. In the quiet moments between public appearances and family obligations, Margaret often reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had once measured success by flawless execution of royal duties now found meaning in imperfect but authentic connections with the people she served. Her story had become proof that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the places where the ground has been broken open and allowed to heal.